a bit after a poor showing on Thursday. Here's Sloan in the pocket. Eddie Harbrow. Eddie.
Yes!
You're a magician! That's what the crowd wanted, and that's exactly what they got. Vintage Eddie Betts.
Crowd really sensing this danger that the Swans are in. Enter Buddy Franklin onto the scene. He delays the give. Franklin, this is Buddy Franklin! This is the greatest show!
Against Kelly, Drew with the left foot slipper, long ball, Cyril's there, he leaves it for Buddy. Cyril, it was like a yo-yo, he picked it up, banked it through for a remarkable goal. He fair him, it was like a yo-yo.
Australian rules football. The game has been graced by some of the best Indigenous talent the country has to offer. Incredible athleticism, a cunning bravado, and freak skill. It's just so good to watch. Put simply, the Indigenous population make the game better.
Shout out on my family, I've been way too busy. Shout out on my people that be really with me.
The AFL men's competition currently has a total of 817 players across their 18 teams. Of that 817, 87 are of Indigenous descent. That's 10.6% of the playing population. When all is said and done for an AFL career, there are players who look to stay in the game and take the next step in their footballing journey. They go from student to educator and become coaches. It might be locally in a junior or senior competition, or it might be in the big time on the grandest of stages. There are currently 180 employed coaches across the system. In that 180 exists a gaping hole in the landscape. You can count the coaches of Indigenous descent on one hand. Roger Hayden, the former Docker, is now a development coach at Fremantle. Chance Bateman, the former Hawthorn star, is now at the West Coast Eagles. And Xavier Clark, a former St Kilda and Brisbane player, is now an assistant coach at Richmond. They are the only three current Indigenous AFL coaches. So what explains this gap in the coaching landscape? And will we ever see another senior coach of Indigenous descent to join in the likes of Graham Polly-Farmer and Barry Cable?
It's either attitude or opportunity. Like it can't be any more or any less. Like if you just distill, the complexity of coaching and the challenges of coaching and the demands of coaching, it's either attitude or opportunity. It's been gleaned over probably 20 years for me, having coached at both community and the elite level. It's a demanding job. It asks a lot of you. It asks a lot of your family. It's an all-in type of obligation. To be good at it, you can't do it part-time. And obviously to reach the highest levels, it's 60 or 70 hours of work a week. And that takes you away from a lot of your family obligations. It takes you away from a lot of community obligations. And my experience is, without people who have that level of competency and capability, they're skills that a lot of us have put back into other parts of our community.
It's a big culture piece, isn't it? Culturally, family and cultural responsibility is probably placed higher up the pecking order in some respects. To use a Cyril Rioli example, he put it before his own football career, let alone him being a coach trying to help other people succeed. He put it before himself because he felt a cultural commitment. Look at Austin Montemurri. He went home early because of I guess family commitments as well. So I wouldn't say it's the reason, but I would say it is a factor for sure.
You also have to think about what they're looking up to. If there are no other people that have been able to kind of break down those barriers and show them the way, because at the moment there are no head coaches, and in the AFL, there hasn't been one for 20 odd years that's Indigenous, then, they must be thinking there's something happening up there that it's not making it a great role for people to follow into. So as much as it's low that they want to do other things when they've finished, part of it is they're not getting tapped on the shoulder like other players might be getting tapped on the shoulder to get into a coaching course, but two, maybe it's not quite the safest environment for them to be in.
I mean, I had a decade worth of conversations with, current AFL players, Indigenous players, but also other talented Aboriginal people. And one of the first things I would say is, do you want to just commit yourself 60 to 70 hours a week exclusively to coaching? And half the mob said no. And I said, well, that's just one of the first decisions you got to work through. But there are people who are committed to doing that.
I think the demands of modern life has meant that Aboriginal people have had to develop the leadership. Other groups always had people that were elders, respected elders, who perhaps took the lead. Not in the same way, because Aboriginal society is also a consensus-based society. So elders always had to get agreement of the group.
The way we communicate with each other, and this is just from my experience, I can't speak on behalf of everyone, it's not yelling and barking, it's very collaborative. It's rather than me dictating to you, this is what I think, and this is how it's going to be. Instead of that, it will be, what do you think? All right, cool, I'll consider that. I don't agree with it, so I'm not going to take it on board, but I'll still listen to your opinion because I value it. And I think if coaching continues to go down this trend, I think that will only bear well for Indigenous or prospective Indigenous coaches, because that kind of mindset, I think, speaks to our culture.
There's a significant load in caring for lots of different people, and so the opportunity and time to go in and take a coach accreditation course often isn't there. Cost is definitely a barrier. The geographic location of certain courses is often a barrier. But I think fundamentally what we also learned is that coach education spaces sometimes aren't culturally safe when they're held within just a mainstream context. From some of the coaches, we learnt that it was really valuable to be able to go and learn in a space where it was culturally safe, because there were only an Indigenous specific course. So the system is still not catering or creating a space that's safe enough for all people to go and feel like they can be comfortable learning in that particular space.
Not just in coaching, but in general, education is very urban centric. Quite often people do leave regional and remote areas to go to the city to learn whatever trade or study it is, be it medicine, be it coaching. I do think that is a very real barrier.
The HR processes around Aboriginal people going into coaching exclude us. They're very generic, they're very mainstream. The 180 current coaches in the AFL system all come from the same background, they all look the same, they all think the same. So the notion of being different and diverse, not only by culture but by way of coaching, I think excludes us automatically on that basis. So you talk about confirmation bias, like it's shockingly obvious. Now that's nobody's fault in particular, but if you don't fix the systemic recruiting issues and the capability that you want to bring in your coaching groups, you just keep appointing the same. It's the same. And a part of our challenge, knowing the three boys that are in the system, it's about how do you maintain your own philosophical principles around coaching and values of coaching that are informed by, the way that our people play and see and want the game to be played, but also accommodate what the system's asking you to be to actually get a job in it. People don't even see ourselves in the elite pathway programs. There are no Aboriginal coaches in the Sandful talent pathway programs. There are no Aboriginal people in the WA talent-based programs. So the AFL invest in talent, playing, coaching, umpiring, but our people are not in those pathway programs. And you've got to ask why, and that's why I go back to my opening point. It's either attitude or opportunity.
I think it's the same for women in football and other things. They talk about a glass ceiling for women. They can only go so far, or there are only certain roles for them. And I think it's the same with Aboriginal people. Obviously, that's starting to shift. There are, for instance, many organisations now, businesses, boards, whatever, where Aboriginal people are being invited on, and also forcing their way in. In the next decade, I think it'll be very different. But at the moment, it's been about, I suppose, power. White fellas, males have dominated football. They've seen it as their preserve, a male preserve. That's starting to shift, and women are coming in as umpires and administrators and presidents of football clubs. But it's still an emerging thing, and that's going to have to happen and will happen because of the huge cohort of players, and many of these have leadership talents and coaching talents. And so inevitably, the AFL will have to draw on that if it's to thrive into the future.
You get down on yourself, hey. You get down.
Well, we know that lateral violence is a real issue in the Aboriginal community, and it plays out not only in, the coaching conversation, but just levels of high performance. It's a high achievers syndrome, and a lot of that just comes from the trauma that a lot of our communities carry and the dual obligations I think our communities demand of us, and it is something you need to contend with. If you can't overcome it, you probably won't be a good coach anyway, because this goes to the demand of coaching. And, as I said, I've coached it, at all levels. And there's high expectation. People ask a lot of you, your players, your supporters, the town that you coach in.
So everyone is fighting over that one spot, and they'll do whatever it takes because they're desperate to get there, right? So they'll do whatever it takes laterally, slander, talk shit, all of this kind of stuff, to try to prop themselves up. And then if someone does succeed, it's really hard for people to be happy because it wasn't me. Even, for example, with me commentating, I'm the only Indigenous person who commentates play-by-play on anywhere that's not Indigenous radio. I know for sure there are people who are going, oh, he's not good enough, he's not this, he's not that, as opposed to being like, oh, that's great. Hopefully, with him there, he can show that we're doing it, that we can do it, and then more opportunities come. So yeah, lateral vibes or violence is a huge barrier.
So it is a sad part of the trauma that our community still carries as a result of a whole range of particular things. It's something that we need to fix as a community. It's an Aboriginal obligation to fix that, nobody else's. And that's why I think the more and more we see other Aboriginal people striving to move into coaching, those in the community with the resourcefulness to support them should be doing so, and building them up and not pulling them down.
In 2002, then owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dan Rooney, was approached by groups concerned with the lack of coaching and front office opportunities in the NFL. This was a reaction to the 2002 firings of head coaches Tony Dungy of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Dennis Green of the Minnesota Vikings, at a time when Dungy had a winning record and Green had just had his first losing season in 10 years. The following proceedings led to the introduction of the Rooney Rule, a National Football League policy that requires league teams to interview ethnic minority candidates for head coaching and senior football operation jobs.
Well, I raised this when I was at the AFL for a decade on a number of occasions, and having spent a lot of time over in the US looking at diversifying coaching groups and leadership positions. In the absence of affirmative policy settings such as the Rooney Rule, So if you don't agree with the Rooney Rule, what do you agree with? The game's the good part of 150 years old. We've only ever had 2 identified head coaches of VFL, AFL level, being Polly Farmer and Barry Cable. It's been 40 years since we've had an AFL umpire of Aboriginal heritage, being Uncle Glenn James. And there's only 3 currently in the 180. And outside of myself and Chris Johnson, there's probably only been 5 Aboriginal people in the coaching ranks in the last 15 years at AFL level. And yet we make up 10 to 12% of AFL playing lists for the last decade or so. So something's fundamentally wrong. So if you don't believe in the affirmative action and creating the right policy settings to facilitate the current regime of decision makers in the AFL system, to at least give our, people who want an opportunity, the opportunity to be interviewed, I think it's incumbent upon the current regime to look at those affirmative actions, but also building the pathways and the programs that give our coaches, developing coaches, the opportunity to be exposed to, the elite system.
What can sometimes happen is people get a look in, people get a leg up because they might know the board, they might be a famous ex-player from the club, blah, 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 all of this kind of stuff. So they at least get their foot in the door. With the Rooney Rule, it at least gets the door open. It doesn't mean they necessarily walk through it, but they get the experience, and then they can talk to their communities as well and offer advice and tips to other people who might want to be going for a job. This is what I learned, this is what worked well, this is what didn't work well. Perhaps you can consider all of that kind of stuff, because as we know, with job interviews in general, you don't always get the first one you go for, and the first time you interview versus after 15, 20 interviews, the level of growth that you have personally is massive.
Therefore, that's why I think it's incumbent to the system to ask itself the question, does it believe that it's minimising its talent pool of current coaches by not having those affirmative actions and policies and programs and pathways for Aboriginal people to at least get ourselves to the starting line of, are we good enough? Because at the moment, we're not even getting to the starting line.
Ways to.
In the 150-year history of Australian rules football, we have only ever seen 2 senior coaches at the elite level of Indigenous heritage. In the past decade, we have seen an Indigenous first gamer in the grand final. We've seen a boy from Darwin become a games record holder. We've seen a skinny kid from Perth become an 8-time All-Australian. If the AFL mantra is don't believe in never, then there will be an expectation for programs and pathways for all becoming a staple of the game. Will that happen? Well, we'll have to wait and see.